The poison hit Ryo young before the glass even finished falling. 1 second he was the most feared man in the city. The next, his fingers wouldn't close. His chest felt like someone had poured concrete into his lungs and was waiting, patiently, for it to set. The cocktail glass rolled off the edge of the table in slow motion. He watched it go, couldn't stop it, couldn't stop any of it. Across the booth, Min Seo was already standing, already smoothing the front of her gown, already done with him. She didn't look back. Not once. That was the part that cut deepest, not the burning crawling up his throat, not the way his vision was fracturing at the edges like broken glass. It was that she didn't even bother to watch him die. He wasn't worth the 2 seconds it would take to turn around. The man who had built an empire from nothing, the man who had chosen her, elevated her, trusted her with the one thing he never gave anyone, his back. And now she was walking away in a dress he had paid for, toward a future he had built, leaving him to choke to death alone in a restaurant booth like an unwanted bill. The suits at the bar were laughing at something. The jazz kept playing, the candles kept flickering. Nobody saw a king dying. His hand hit the table. The sound it made was small, embarrassing. His right hand, the one that had signed death warrants and crushed rivals and built the most dangerous syndicate this city had ever seen, couldn't manage more than a weak slap against polished mahogany. Move, he ordered his body. Get up. You are Ryo Jung. His body had heard better offers tonight. The darkness started at the corners of his eyes and moved inward, calm and unhurried, like it had all the time in the world, like it knew he wasn't going anywhere. And then hands. Warm, certain, real. They cupped his jaw with a steadiness that had no business existing in a moment like this, tilting his face upward before his chin could hit his chest. He blinked, fighting through the blur, and found a pair of dark eyes staring back at him, not with panic, not with the frozen shock of someone watching something terrible unfold, with recognition. Like she had been expecting this. Like she already knew exactly what was happening to him and had exactly 7 minutes to stop it. Stay with me, she said. Not a plea, a command. Laura Woods had worked the VIP floor of Obsidian for 3 years. She had poured champagne for men who made governments disappear. She had cleared plates while deals were struck that ended lives. She had learned, very early, to read every silent signal this world gave off the table that went too quiet, the drink that sat untouched, the woman who left without her coat. She had seen the glass fall, she had seen Min Seo walk, she had seen the color drain from the most dangerous man in the room in under 90 seconds. And she was the only person in that entire restaurant who was moving. She didn't scream for help. She didn't reach for her phone. She pulled the apron ties tighter, leaned in close so no one at the bar could read her lips, and she made Ryo Young a promise he didn't have the air left to refuse. I know what she gave you, and if you can give me 20 minutes, you are not going to die tonight. Ryo Jung had never needed saving in his life. He needed it now. Hello, family. Before we go any further, I need to know where in the world you are watching this from. Drop your location in the comments right now, because I genuinely want to say hello to every single one of you and see just how far this story is traveling. Subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what comes next, because what Laura does in the next 20 minutes will change both of their lives forever. Laura didn't hesitate. That was the thing Ryo would remember later, in the fragments of memory that survived the night. Not the burning, not the fear, not Min Seo's retreating back. He would remember that this woman, this stranger in a white shirt and a black apron, didn't hesitate for a single second. She got her shoulder under his arm before he could even process what was happening. His weight fell into her and she absorbed it, knees bending slightly, redistributing, like she'd done this before. Like carrying a half-conscious, 200-pound man through a crowded restaurant was something she'd trained for. Walk, she said quietly, close to his ear. Just walk. Nobody's looking at us if we're walking. He tried. His legs were numb from the knee down, but something in her voice reached past the fog and grabbed hold of the last functioning part of his nervous system. He walked, barely. A slow, deliberate shuffle that she disguised by keeping close, her hand pressed flat against his ribs under the cover of his jacket, steering him away from the main floor, away from the bar, away from the candlelit tables where people were still laughing and drinking and living their ordinary lives. She pushed open a door marked staff only with her back and pulled him through. The service corridor was a different world. Harsh fluorescent light, the smell of industrial cleaner and dish grease and hot metal. A busboy looked up from a crate of glasses, clocked Laura's expression, and found somewhere else to be immediately. "Through here," she said. "Don't talk." They moved through the kitchen at the edge of a controlled panic she never let become visible on her face. A chef glanced up. She gave him the look that said, "Not your business. Keep chopping." And he did. The back exit was a heavy steel door with a push bar. She hit it with her hip and the cold night air came rushing in, sharp and chemical and alive. A car was idling in the service alley. Her car, a dented, dependable sedan that had seen better years, engine already running, driver's door unlocked. "How?" he started. "I texted my own number from your phone while you were slumping," she said. "I needed to know if you were actually going to make it to the alley." She got him into the passenger seat and buckled him in like he was a child, fingers quick and impersonal. "You made it. The car gets ditched after tonight," she said, before he could ask. "I know." She was in the driver's seat and moving before his door was fully closed. Ryo Jung had been driven by bodyguards in blacked-out SUVs his entire adult life. He had never once sat in the passenger seat of a car this old. With a crack in the dashboard and a pine air freshener hanging from the mirror, and a woman who hadn't introduced herself yet driving like she knew every back street in the city by heart. What did she use? His voice came out ruined, scraped. Laura checked the rearview mirror before she answered. "Something synthetic, fast-acting, designed to look like cardiac arrest. A beat. Your pupils are uneven, which means it's already in your blood-brain barrier. You've got maybe 4 hours before the second wave hits, and that one is worse." He stared at her profile. The neat bun, the jaw set with concentration. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows what that poison does." She turned left without signaling, navigating by instinct through streets he didn't recognize. That's all that matters right now. He didn't have the strength to push it further. He leaned his head against the cold window and watched the city scroll past the city he owned, the city that was already, in this moment, being sliced up and redistributed without his knowledge, and tried to keep breathing. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had no doorman, no cameras in the stairwell, and neighbors who had long since learned to ask no questions. Laura had clearly chosen it for exactly those reasons. It was small, clean, specific in the way only people who'd had to be careful about what they kept around them were specific. Books stacked by category, shoes lined up by the door, a single window overlooking a fire escape with a clear sightline to the street below. Rio's trained eye cataloged all of it in the seconds between the door opening and her guiding him to the couch. "Lie down," she said, already moving toward the kitchen. He didn't lie down. He sat on the edge of the couch with his elbows on his knees and watched her open a cabinet above the refrigerator locked, he noted, a padlock he hadn't seen her use a key for, and pull out a metal box. "What is that?" he said. "The reason you're going to be alive tomorrow." She set the box on the counter and opened it. He couldn't see all of what was inside from the couch, but he saw syringes, small amber vials, a blood pressure cuff, 2 items he couldn't identify. "The antidote isn't perfect. It's going to hurt, and it's going to make you sick before it makes you better. But it will interrupt the second wave. Where did you get that?" She looked at him over her shoulder. Just for a moment. Something moved across her face, not quite pain, not quite memory, and then it was gone and she was professional again, hands moving with precise, practiced efficiency. "I've had it for a long time," she said. "I hoped I'd never need it." He had too many questions and not enough air for any of them. She came to the couch with the blood pressure cuff and a prepared syringe, and she sat beside him, not crouched, not deferential, beside him, as an equal, and took his arm without asking permission. Her fingers found his pulse at the wrist first, counting silently, watching a clock on the wall that he would later notice was set 3 minutes fast. "This is going to feel like fire," she said. "I know what fire feels like. Not like this." She looked at him directly. Hold still. He held still. The needle went in. And then everything she'd promised arrived all at once. And Ryo Jung, who had been tortured twice in his career and come out of both sessions without making a sound, made a sound. Laura's hand pressed flat against his sternum. Not gentle. Firm. Grounding. I've got you, she said. Don't fight it. Let it work. He didn't have a choice. His body made the decision for him. And somewhere between the burning and the cold that followed, the night swallowed him whole. He woke to gray light through a window, and the smell of instant coffee and the absolute certainty that something was wrong. Not wrong here, in this room. Wrong out there, in the city, in his world. He sat up too fast, and his skull punished him for it immediately. A bright, vicious throb that made his vision white out for 3 seconds. He breathed through it, took inventory. He was on the couch with a blanket over him that he didn't remember. His jacket was folded on the chair across the room. His phone was gone. Laura was sitting at the kitchen table with a laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. She'd changed out of the restaurant uniform into a gray sweatshirt, and her hair was still up, slightly looser now. She was watching something on the screen with an expression he couldn't read. "Your phone is in the kitchen drawer," she said without looking up. "I took the battery out. The car was already gone. She'd left it 3 miles away in a supermarket lot before dawn and walked back, taking a route that added 40 minutes and crossed no cameras she hadn't already mapped." He opened his mouth. "Because they will have already flagged it," she said. "The cell tower data alone puts you at the restaurant at the time of the incident. If the SIM goes active anywhere in this city, she will know you're alive within an hour." She turned the laptop to face him across the room. The screen showed a press conference. Min Seo stood at a podium in a charcoal blazer, her face arranged into the precise expression of a woman bearing grief with strength and composure. Behind her stood men. Ryo recognized men who had bowed their heads to him yesterday, who had built their entire positions on his authority standing with their hands folded and their eyes forward, already transferred. The headline banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Jung Industries executive sidelined by sudden cardiac illness. Park Min Seo announces interim leadership. Cardiac illness." She had even written the cover story before she picked up the glass. Something happened in Ryeo's chest that had nothing to do with the poison. He sat very still with his hands on his knees and watched the woman he had chosen, the woman he had built a future around, lie to a room full of cameras with the exact same face she had worn when she told him she loved him. And the cameras believed her. Of course they did. She was extraordinary at it. She moved fast, Laura said quietly. She planned this for months. He heard his own voice say it and understood for the first time the full geometry of it. Not an impulse, not a power grab made in a moment of opportunity. Months, while he was beside her, while he thought he was choosing her. She was already done with me before last night. Last night was just the execution date. Laura said nothing. She turned the laptop back around and let him sit with it. That was the first thing she did that he would remember later. The first thing that made him look at her differently. She didn't fill the silence. She didn't offer comfort he didn't ask for. She just let the truth take up the space it needed. He looked around the apartment again. The fire escape, the locked cabinet, the books not decorative, red, spines cracked and pages turned back. A woman who had chosen this specific building, this specific apartment, this specific life of deliberate invisibility. "You're going to tell me who you are eventually," he said. "When you're well enough that it matters," she said. "Right now, drink the water on the coffee table, all of it. You're going into withdrawal in the next few hours, and you need to be hydrated before it starts." He looked at the glass on the coffee table, then he picked it up and drank. She was right about the withdrawal. She was right about all of it. It started that afternoon as a deep, relentless ache in every joint, the kind of pain that had no specific location and no logic, that moved and mutated and laughed at the idea of being managed. By evening, it had evolved into something uglier. A cold sweat that no blanket could touch. A nausea that came in waves and brought old memories with it. A trembling in his hands that Ryo found almost unbearable simply because of what it meant. His hands did not tremble, had never trembled. He had built an empire with these hands, and they were shaking over a woman's calculated chemistry. He was furious about it. He was furious about everything, in the specific, cornered way of a person who cannot direct their rage at its actual target, because its actual target is currently on television accepting condolences. Laura became the available target. "I don't need you standing over me," he said, when she came to check his temperature for the second time in an hour. "I know you don't need it," she said, pressing 2 fingers to the gland below his jaw with clinical detachment. "I'm doing it anyway. I'm not your patient. You are literally my patient. I don't answer to waitresses." She took her hand back. She looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was not hurt, not cowed, something more like a person deciding whether a conversation was worth having. Then she sat in the chair across from the couch, rested her forearms on her knees, and looked at him steadily. "My name is Laura Woods," she said. "I've been a waitress at Obsidian for 3 years. Before that, I moved around a lot. Before that, I was the daughter of a man who was very deep in a world not unlike yours. Which is how I know what was in that glass and how I know how to counteract it, and how I know that the men she sends to look for your body will start with the restaurant staff." She paused. "You can be angry at me. I'm not going anywhere. But I need you to understand that when I say the next 72 hours are critical, I am not being dramatic. I have seen this poison finish the job 3 days later because the person didn't take it seriously. I have watched it happen. So you can disrespect me all you want after you're well. Right now, you are going to drink the second dose when I tell you to, and you are going to let me check your vitals, and you are going to hate every second of it in silence." Rio stared at her. Nobody spoke to him like that. Nobody in his entire adult life had spoken to him like that, with that particular combination of frankness and complete fearlessness, and he genuinely didn't know what to do with it. "Fine," he said. His voice came out less sharp than he'd intended. A small thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. She went back to the kitchen to prepare the second dose, and Rieo lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling, and thought, despite everything, despite the burning and the shaking and the empire bleeding out without him, that this woman was possibly the strangest person he had ever encountered. The 72 hours were what she said they would be. Brutal and long and humbling in ways that Rieo had no framework for. She was there through all of it, not hovering, never hovering, but present. Making food he could keep down. Changing the cold cloth on his forehead at 3 a.m. without being asked and without making him ask. Talking to him sometimes in the small hours, not about him, not about his situation, just talking about a book she was reading, about the restaurant, about small, unremarkable things that had no weight or danger attached to them, and he found, to his confusion, that the sound of her voice was the thing that most reliably pulled him back from the worst of it. On the second night, when the fever spiked and the room felt like it was breathing, she sat on the edge of the couch and held his wrist for an hour straight, monitoring his pulse, and he didn't tell her to stop. On the 4th morning, when the worst of the withdrawal had finally broken, and Rio could sit upright without the room tilting, Laura came home from a short errand and set a bag on the kitchen counter without a word. He was on the couch, the laptop open, watching news footage of Minseo doing what Minseo did best, working a room, constructing loyalty, making herself inevitable. Beside the laptop was a burner phone Laura had brought him 2 days earlier with no explanation of where she'd gotten it. "2 men came to the restaurant last night," Laura said, setting down a bottle of water and a takeout container. Her voice was even informational. They weren't customers. Rio closed the laptop. "Tell me." They asked the manager about the VIP staff rotation for last Thursday. Asked specifically which server had the section near the east booths. She sat across from him and looked at her hands for a moment. "Chang covered for me. Told them the section was handled by a girl who quit last week. Gave them a name that doesn't exist. They seem to accept it. They'll be back," Rio said. "I know. They'll come here next. They're methodical." He was already thinking through it, the old machinery of threat assessment spinning back up despite the residual ache in his bones. They would have pulled the service entrance footage already. If they have your face. The camera on the service entrance has been on a 4-hour loop for 8 months. Laura said simply. The owner doesn't know. I made sure of it. My father taught me to make sure of things like that everywhere I spent time. Old habit. Ryo went quiet. I also took a different route home every day this week, she continued. Paid cash for everything. Told the neighbor across the hall I have a sick cousin staying with me in case she heard movement. She looked up and met his eyes, calm and direct. I've lived carefully for a long time. I know how to not be found. He looked at her for a long moment. Truly looked at her at the practicality of her, the unsentimental intelligence of it, the way she had done all of this not as an exceptional measure but as a matter of course, because this was simply how she moved through the world. Your father, he said. Something shifted behind her eyes. Small, controlled. He was a medic, she said. Not a licensed one. The kind that certain organizations keep on payroll because hospitals ask questions. He kept people alive who weren't supposed to go to hospitals. A pause. He kept me educated. About a lot of things. And where is he now? The shift again. Smaller this time. More practiced. Gone, she said. 3 years ago. The word carried a specific weight that Ryo recognized not simply loss, but loss that had been processed, integrated, made into something survivable. She had been carrying it long enough that it had changed shape. He didn't press further. She didn't offer. Instead, she nodded toward the burner phone on the table. Have you been able to reach anyone? He picked it up. There was one number he'd had memorized for 15 years, not saved in any phone, not written down anywhere, a number that belonged to a man named Juan, who had been with him since the beginning, since before the Empire, since the years when they were both young and dangerous and had nothing to lose. He'd called it twice in the last 2 days. No answer. He called it again now. 3 rings. 4. 5. And then, for the first time, a click, but it wasn't Juan's voice. It was a voice Ryo hadn't expected. A voice that sent something cold sliding down through his chest in a way the poison hadn't managed. A voice he recognized so precisely, had trusted so completely, that for several seconds his brain simply refused to process what it was telling him. You're alive, said the voice. Calm, almost curious. I told her the dose was sufficient. She's going to be very disappointed. Ryo did not move. He did not breathe. On the other end of the phone, his right-hand man, Co. June, 12 years at his side, the man who stood in every room and managed every threat and had never, not once, given Ryo any reason to question his position, let the silence hold for a moment. Then, you should have stayed dead, Ryo. This is cleaner for everyone. The call dropped. The silence where Juan should have been was its own answer. Ryo had called that number 3 times now. Juan had been with him since before any of this existed, before the title, before the empire, before the man Rieo had constructed over the bones of the boy he used to be. If Juan wasn't picking up, it was because Juan couldn't. Minseo was thorough. He had always admired that about her. Ryo set the phone down on the table. He set it down carefully, precisely, like it was something that might break, and then he sat absolutely still with his hands flat on his thighs. Laura was watching him. He could feel it. He didn't look up. 12 years. Not Minseo's contact. Not a rival's agent. His. Seo Jun, who had stood 6 feet behind him at every meeting, who had tasted food before Ryo when the threat level was elevated, who had, and this was the part that arrived last and cut deepest, who had looked him in the eye 2 days before the dinner and said, I'll make sure the evening goes smoothly, boss. The evening had gone smoothly, for everyone except Rieo. He sat with it, the full weight of it. Not just the betrayal, but the architecture of his own arrogance, the way he had built his inner circle not on genuine trust, but on assessed utility, on measured performance, on people who were valuable to him because of what they could do. He had never asked who Seo Jun was beyond the function he served, had never asked who any of them were, because to him, people were instruments, positioned, maintained, replaced when they failed. He had never considered that the instrument might be maintaining him. His entire empire, 12 years of brutal, meticulous construction, and somewhere inside it, at the closest possible distance, something had been rotting. Not because he'd been careless, because he'd been exactly who he was. "June," he said. His voice was quiet, flat, the specific flatness of something catastrophic being held very carefully. Laura said nothing. "My right-hand man." He finally looked up. "He supplied the poison. He's been inside this from the beginning." She didn't look surprised. She absorbed it with the calm of someone who had learned long ago that people were capable of the full range of what they were capable of. "How deep?" she asked. "I don't know yet." He stood up. The movement was steadier than it had been. Not back to full strength, but close enough. "But I know now that the people I trusted the most were the ones with the best access to betray me. And I built it that way. I built the whole thing that way." He moved to the window, standing to the side of it in the practiced position of someone who had spent years not standing in front of glass. "I thought loyalty was something you purchased. With power, with security, with enough that people couldn't afford to lose you. And?" Laura said. He looked at the city outside, his city, or what had been. "And I gave June everything he needed to feel secure, and nothing he needed to feel loyal." He turned back to face her. "There's a difference. I never understood that there was a difference." She looked at him for a long moment, not with pity, not with the satisfaction of someone whose worldview had been confirmed, with something quieter than either of those, something that looked almost like recognition. "My father used to say that the people most certain they've earned trust are always the last to understand that trust isn't earned by what you provide," she said. "It's earned by what you're willing to lose." Rieo held her gaze. Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent and ongoing. He had lost everything. The question, the only question that mattered now, was what he was willing to build with what remained. He looked at Laura Woods, standing in her gray sweatshirt in her small, careful apartment that smelled like coffee and safety and 3 years of chosen invisibility, and he thought, here is a person who has lost things too. Here is a person who rebuilt something worth keeping. "I need a plan," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about one." He almost smiled. Didn't, but it was close. "Tell me," he said. She went to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table, and they sat across from each other in the gray morning light, the fallen king and the waitress who had caught him, and began. The plan took days to build, and they built it the way Laura did everything carefully, without waste, talking through each piece at the kitchen table while the city outside went about its business unaware. It was the talking that undid him, not the strategy sessions, though those were real and necessary, and she was sharper in them than anyone he'd ever sat across from. It was the other talking, the kind that happened at the edges of the day, when the work was done and the coffee had gone cold and neither of them had moved to go to bed yet. She told him about her father in pieces. Not the whole shape of it at once, but fragments, offered when they fit naturally into something else they were discussing. How he'd taught her that the body tells the truth before the mind does, useful for reading poisoned patients and useful for reading dangerous men. How he'd kept a locked cabinet in every apartment they'd ever lived in, always the same kind of padlock, always stocked the same way, because consistency was the only real safety. How he'd made her memorize 3 exit routes from every building she spent more than a week in, so that leaving quickly would never require thinking. "He sounds like he was terrifying," Ryo said one night. "He was," Laura said. "He was also the most devoted person I've ever known." Those 2 things were completely true at the same time. Ryo thought about that for a long time after she'd gone to bed. He thought about it the next morning when he woke before her and stood at the kitchen window watching the street below, cataloging out of habit the woman walking the dog, the delivery driver, the man who'd been parked in the same spot for 40 minutes. He thought about the version of devoted he had understood his entire life, which was a version that looked like control, loyalty purchased, proximity enforced. He had confused possession for protection and called it love, and the evidence of how wrong he was had walked away from him in a glittering gown without looking back. Laura appeared behind him with 2 cups of coffee. She set one on the counter beside him without a word and stood a few feet away, looking at the same street, not asking what he was thinking, not filling the space with anything it didn't need. He picked up the coffee. Their shoulders were close in the small kitchen, He was aware of the proximity in a way he hadn't been before, not uncomfortably, but consciously. The way you become conscious of warmth when you've spent too long in the cold. "You never talk about yourself," she said. "Not an accusation, observation. There's not much worth saying." "That's not true." She looked at her coffee. "You talk about your empire constantly, your plans, your enemies, your next move, but you never talk about Ryo Jung. Those things are Ryo Jung." "No," she said, simply, without cruelty. "Those things are what Ryo Jung built so that nobody would need to look at Ryo Jung." He turned to look at her. She was still watching the street. He could have deflected. He was extraordinarily good at deflecting, had made a career of it. A whole architecture of projection and intimidation designed specifically so that nobody ever pointed at the thing underneath and said that, "There, that's the real one." "My mother left when I was 7, he said instead. He heard his own voice say it and didn't recognize the tone of it, quieter than he meant. Older somehow. "My father was in this life. Not at the level I reached. Lower. Rougher. He thought she left because of the danger." A pause. "She left because he gave everything to the work and nothing to her. He never understood the difference." Laura was very still. "I watched him lose everything that mattered while he was busy protecting everything that didn't," Ryo said. "And then I grew up and built the exact same structure and called it an improvement because mine was bigger." He looked back at the street. "Minseo was never a person to me. She was a position. A strategic alliance. I told myself it was practical. Really, it was just easier than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" He looked at her then, directly. She met it without flinching, as she met everything, and there was something in her face, open and careful and undefended, in a way that his entire life had trained him to read as weakness, and that he understood now. Standing in this small kitchen with his empire gone, and nothing left to hide behind, was the bravest thing he had ever seen. "Letting someone actually in," he said. The morning light came through the window at a low angle and caught the side of her face, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched just past the point of accident and into something deliberate. Then she said, "Drink your coffee before it gets cold," and turned back to the table, and he smiled small, private, the kind of smile that doesn't know it's happening, and followed her. That was the night everything shifted. Not dramatically, not with the orchestrated intensity of the world he came from, where everything was performance and scale and designed impact. It happened the way real things happen quietly, in the margin of an ordinary moment. She was reading at the table and he was reviewing notes on the burner phone, and at some point he looked up and found her already looking at him, and neither of them looked away, and that was it. That was the whole of it. Simple, unprecedented, terrifying in a way that nothing in his career had ever managed to be. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his back. No speeches, no declarations. Just that the specific gravity of two people who had survived difficult things deciding, without words, to stop surviving separately. By the end of the second week, they had a list. 7 names. Former syndicate members, enforcers, logistics men, one financial specialist who had been cut loose by Minseo in the weeks since the takeover. People who had built their livelihoods inside Ryo's organization and found themselves discarded the moment it changed hands, their loyalty to the old structure making them liabilities to the new one. Ghosts, Laura called them. People the syndicate had already stopped looking for because they'd already stopped mattering. "They have every reason to come back," Ryo said. "They have every reason to be afraid," Laura said. "Those aren't the same thing. You need to give them a reason that's stronger than the fear." He thought about that. About what he would have offered. Before. Money. Security. Position. The transactional logic that had governed every relationship he'd ever built. He thought about what had happened to that logic. Where it had gotten him. "The truth," he said. Laura looked at him. "I tell them the truth. What was done to me. What I know about June's involvement. What she's doing to the organization." He set down the phone. "Not what they'll gain from helping me. What it will cost them if she stays." "That's different from how you used to operate," Laura said. "Yes," he said. "It is." They went out carefully. in the hours when the city was busy enough to absorb 2 more faces. Laura had built a discipline around movement, different routes, different timing, cash only, nothing that created a pattern. She moved through the city like water, finding the path of least resistance by instinct, and Ryo watched her and understood that this was not anxiety, this was competence, the deeply integrated competence of someone who had been navigating dangerous spaces since childhood. He found himself adjusting to her rhythm without being asked to, matching her pace, taking her lead on when to stop and when to move. It was not a thing that came naturally to a man who had spent 15 years as the fixed point everything else orbited around, but it came. The first name on the list was a man called Beck, former head of security for Ryo's East District operations, discarded in the first week of Min Seo's takeover, along with the entire East team when she brought in her own people. They found him in a bar in the lower quarter, nursing something cheap and watching football on a screen that was too small for the room. Beck looked up when Ryo sat down across from him. His face went through 5 different expressions in 3 seconds: shock, disbelief, relief, calculation, and then something that was none of those things, something simpler and older. He looked at his former boss, really looked, at the absence of the suit, the car, the entourage, at the civilian jacket and the burner phone and the waitress sitting 1 stool down watching the door. "You look terrible," Beck said. "I was poisoned," Ryo said. By June, Beck went very still. "She didn't know I knew about the right-hand piece until 3 days ago," Ryo said. "Now I'm telling you, because you deserve to know who actually ended what we built. And it wasn't only Min Seo." Beck stared at him for a long time. Then he picked up his drink and finished it and set the glass down and said, "What do you need?" "Not what's in it for me. Not what are you offering. What do you need?" Ryo felt something shift in his chest. Unfamiliar and certain. "A team," he said. "And time." They had both by the end of the week. 6 of the 7 names came through men and 1 woman who arrived without promises of reward, who came because of what had been done and what they understood about what would happen next if nothing was done. Ryo gathered them in a rotating set of locations that Laura mapped and secured, and he talked to them differently than he had ever talked to anyone who worked for him. Directly, honestly, acknowledging what had failed and why, and what he understood now that he hadn't before. He watched them respond to it, and understood he had wasted 15 years. He put Beck on the evidence. The financial trail was the one thing June couldn't disappear. 4 years of supply chain transactions, routed through shell accounts that Beck, who had overseen security for the organization's eastern operations, knew exactly how to trace. It would take time. They had a little. The 8th name never came. Park Dae-young, former mid-level logistics coordinator, let go in Min Seo's second purge, had sent word through a mutual contact that he was in. He'd been given a location and a time, and Ryo had accepted it because the team was still 1 short, and because Dae-young knew the layout of the building where the induction ceremony was scheduled to take place. He should have trusted the thing in his stomach that had been uneasy since the message came. But the ceremony was 4 days out, and Dae-young was the only person alive who had worked inside the Sinhwa Grand's service infrastructure, who knew which corridors were swept and which were not. Ryo had made the calculation and overridden the instinct. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had built his empire. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had nearly ended his life. They were at the 3rd safe house, a storage unit outside the city that Beck had sourced, cleared of its original contents, fitted with basics when it happened. 11 at night. 4 members of the team present along with Ryo and Laura. The remaining 2 were rotating watch on the street below, Beck's protocol since the 2nd safe house. The ceremony was 4 days away. Laura was standing at the makeshift table, going over logistics when her head came up. She had her father's instincts, the body's knowledge before the mind's, and what she felt was 3 seconds before Ryo heard the vehicles. 2 of them. Fast. "Out," she said. Not loud, not panicked. Absolute. They moved. The team knew to move. Beck had drilled for exactly this type of incursion from exactly this type of compromised source, because Ryo had told them to prepare for it, based on what he now understood about how Minseo operated. 2 members went through the rear ventilation access. Bake and another man took defensive positions. Ryo grabbed Laura's arm and pulled her toward the secondary exit in the back wall, a cut panel that looked like solid structure from the outside. She pulled back. "They'll come through the back," she said. "They know this place. Dae-young walked it with us." She was right. He knew she was right before she finished saying it. He reversed direction, came back to the center of the space, putting himself between the front entry and where Laura stood. Behind him, he could hear Beck communicating in short, clipped signals. The door came in hard. 4 enforcers. Minseo's new people, he didn't recognize the faces, which meant she'd been building this layer of the organization for longer than he'd understood. They were professional and fast, and they came in expecting a dispersed, panicked group, and found instead 2 men standing ready, and 1 former boss who had spent 15 years knowing exactly how violence moved. What followed was not elegant. It was not the choreographed display of his reputation. It was brutal and close and physical in a way that his body protested at every turn, the residual damage of the poison making itself known in sharp, specific ways. His left side was slower than it should have been. His grip strength wasn't back to full. He felt all of it and worked around it, using positioning where he couldn't use speed, using knowledge of how men like this were trained to move against them at every point. The 4th enforcer got past Beck and went for Laura. That was a mistake. Not because Ryo reached him first, though Ryo did reach him, from across the space in 3 strides that cost him significantly. It was a mistake because Laura, who had grown up in the world these men operated in, who had learned from a man who survived that world for decades, was not standing frozen waiting to be reached. She was not a victim of this story. She had never been. The enforcer found that out in the 2 seconds before Ryo arrived, and by the time Ryo pulled the man off her, she had already done the significant work. Ryo finished it. The room went quiet. He turned. Laura was against the back wall, breathing hard, her eyes moving immediately to assess him, not herself, him, checking what the fight had cost. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." His left side. "Not deep. Are you—" "I'm fine." She crossed to him and pressed her palm against the cut with the same steadiness she'd had the first night, when his face was in her hands and the glass was rolling off the table, and she was the only certain thing in the room. "You came for me anyway," she said, quietly. "Just for him. Always," he said. It came out without premeditation, without calculation, just true. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she was already reaching for the first aid kit she'd had the presence of mind to grab from the table on the way to the wall. They left the safe house within 4 minutes. Dae-young's location was flagged and distributed. The ceremony was in 3 days, and now Min-seo knew he was alive and mobile and she would move the timeline. They had to move faster. The ceremony was held at the Sinhua Grand, the same hotel where Ryeo had hosted every major syndicate event for 10 years, where the rooms knew him, and the staff had spent a decade watching him hold court, and where the building's layout existed in his memory with the clarity of a blueprint. Min-seo had chosen it deliberately. Of course she had. She was making a statement about succession, holding the coronation in the dead king's cathedral. He let her. They went in through the service infrastructure, a route that Ryo had mapped 15 years ago and kept in his head because paranoia was the tax on power, and he had always paid it faithfully. 8 of them moving through the back architecture of the building, while the main ballroom 2 floors above filled with the city's most dangerous people gathering to watch a woman be crowned. The ballroom held 60. Cartel leadership, regional captains, financial controllers, the men who made the syndicate function at every level all assembled to pledge loyalty to a new head, to witness the formalization of a transfer of power that most of them had accepted as complete and final. They were not expecting the transfer to be contested. Ryo came in through the east access, a service door behind the main dais that the hotel had fitted with an electronic lock 2 years ago. A lock that used an access code that hadn't been changed, because no one had thought to change it, because no one had thought to plan for this. He stepped through it alone, ahead of the team, and he stood at the edge of the dais in the seconds before anyone in the room registered that the geometry had changed. Min-seo was at the center of the room. Her back was to the dais. She was mid-sentence, her voice carrying in the precise, confident register of a woman who had rehearsed this and knew she had the room. Seo-jun stood to her left. He saw Ryo first. The expression on Jun's face, the specific, complex collapse of a man confronting a consequence he had calculated against and lost, was something Ryo would carry with him for a long time. Not with satisfaction, with the peculiar sorrow of seeing clearly something that had been invisible for 12 years. The room registered Ryo in stages, a captain near the back, then the two beside him. Then a wave of recognition moving forward through the assembled leadership until the room was quiet in the particular way that 60 dangerous people go quiet when the situation they are in has fundamentally changed. Min Seo turned. Her face did what it always did, arranged itself, instantly, into controlled composure. She looked at him with the same eyes she'd used to look at him across the table the night she handed him a poisoned glass. And he understood now that this face had always been a performance, and what was underneath it was simply absence. "You look well," she said. Her voice was steady. She had prepared for this contingency too. He had expected nothing less. "You should have done it yourself," he said, not loudly. The room was quiet enough that he didn't need volume. Not because it would have worked, but because it would have at least been honest. "Ryo, no." He moved down from the dais into the room, and the assembled leadership parted not out of her authority, not out of fear of what she'd ordered, but out of something older and more complicated. The specific deference of people who are trying to determine where the real power in a room has relocated. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here because these people deserve to know what they've pledged themselves to." He looked at the room. The faces he knew, men he'd worked with for years. Men who'd built positions inside the organization he'd constructed, and the ones he didn't, Min Seo's imports, her architecture overlaid onto his. Seo-jun sourced and supplied the poison, he said. Not a speech, not a performance, a statement of fact delivered to people who needed it, not on Min Seo's behalf. On their behalf, together, for longer than either of them has acknowledged. He looked at June. "How long?" June said nothing. His face was the face of a man whose calculation had run out. 4 years, said a voice from behind Ryo. Beck, stepping through the east door with the team behind him, had clearly decided that silence was no longer a functional strategy for anyone present. "I have the financial records, the communication logs, the supply chain documentation going back 4 years. Beck crossed the room and set a tablet on the nearest table, screen up, visible to the captains seated closest. It's thorough. The room shifted. That specific shift of power, not theatrical, not violent, but systemic, the realignment of calculated loyalties in real time, moved through the assembled leadership like a change in air pressure. Min Seo's composure fractured first at the eyes. Small, precise. The tell she had never let him see before, because before, he hadn't known to look. Her personal security detail, 4 men she had brought in from outside the syndicate, loyal only to her, had swept the room before the guests arrived. Nobody had checked the host. She looked at the room and saw what was happening in it, and made a decision that was, if nothing else, consistent with who she was. She reached into the evening clutch at her side. Beck was faster. He had been waiting for exactly that move since they'd entered the building, had positioned himself for it, and he handled it without drama or excess. 2 of the team secured June simultaneously. It was over in seconds, clean and conclusive. Ryo stood in the center of the room with 60 people looking at him and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph. Not the hot satisfaction of revenge. Something quieter and more complicated. The specific exhaustion of a man who has burned down what he built and is standing in the ash trying to decide what a better thing looks like. He looked at the assembled captains, men with their own agendas and their own calculations running, and he said, "I'm not asking you to trust me tonight. Trust is earned. I understand that now." He paused. "What I'm asking is that you give me the time to earn it." The room was silent for a long moment. Then, the captain nearest the back moved. Wu, the oldest man in the room, the one who had sat in this syndicate before Ryo had built it into what it became, whose continued presence at every table, was itself a form of institutional memory, set both hands on the mahogany, and pushed himself slowly to his feet. He bowed, small, deliberate, unambiguous. The room followed. It was past 3 in the morning when they returned to the apartment. Not because they had to, the organization was Ryo's again, and there were a dozen places it could house him before morning, but because they both, without discussing it, went there. The place that had been the fixed point through all of it. Laura stood at the window with her coffee, watching the city. The same window, but everything on the other side of it had changed. Ryo stood a few feet behind her, jacket off, the bandaged cut on his left side a contained ache that he was ignoring for the moment. "What happens now?" she said, not anxious, genuinely asking. He came to stand beside her. Their reflections were faint in the glass, him in the dark shirt, her in the white one, the city lights behind them smearing into something almost soft. "I restructure," he said. "The financial operation, the leadership, the internal accountability systems. Everything that made it possible for June to operate invisibly for 4 years gets rebuilt from the ground up." A pause. "I've been thinking about what you said once, about what trust costs." "What your father said," she corrected, a small smile at the edge of her mouth. "What your father said," he agreed. "That it's earned by what you're willing to lose." He looked at her. "I'm willing to lose the parts of it that require me to be the man I was. The distance, the architecture of fear." He held her gaze. "I'm not willing to lose what I found in this apartment." She turned from the window. The city behind her, the low light, and that face warm and steady and completely without performance, showing him exactly what it contained because she had decided he was worth showing. "That's a significant statement from a man who not 3 weeks ago told me he doesn't answer to waitresses," she said. "I was wrong about a lot of things 3 weeks ago." "You were wrong about a lot of things for about 15 years. "Yes," he said. "I was." She held his eyes for another moment, and then she closed the distance between them and put her hand against his chest, flat and certain, the way she had the first night when he was dying and she was the only thing keeping him tethered. He covered her hand with his. "I don't want to be a secret," she said, quiet and clear. "I don't want to be the woman you keep separate from the rest of your life. I've been invisible long enough. If I'm in all the way." "You rebuilt the whole thing with me," he said. "You go nowhere near invisible." He brought her hand up and held it properly, his thumb moving across her knuckles. "Whatever this becomes, I want you standing in the center of it. Not behind me, beside me." She looked at him for a long time, reading him the way she had always read him, not the surface, not the presentation, but the actual thing underneath. The Ryo Jung who existed before the Empire and would exist after it, the one he had spent 15 years ensuring nobody could see. She saw him. She had seen him from the beginning, from the moment she cupped a dying man's face in a restaurant booth and told him he was not going to die tonight. "Okay," she said. Not a concession, a decision, made with full information, full clarity, by a woman who did nothing without understanding exactly what she was choosing. He pulled her in and held her, and she let herself be held. And outside the window, the city moved through the last dark hours before dawn, the way cities do indifferent to the specific human events taking place inside its buildings, carrying on with the vast, ordinary business of being alive. In the morning, there would be restructuring and politics, and the long, complicated work of rebuilding something better from the bones of something flawed. There would be hard conversations and harder decisions, and the kind of sustained effort that empire building required, this time with different values driving it. But right now, there was just this: the apartment, the window, the city. 2 people who had survived a poisoning and a betrayal and a war, and found, in the middle of all of it, the one thing neither of them had thought to plan for, the one thing that had not been transactional, not strategic, not purchased or positioned or arranged, just real, unscheduled and real, arriving without warning in the form of warm, steady hands, and a voice that said, "Stay with me," and a man who, for the first time in his life, had listened.